Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to the 15th webinar series. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the organization, I wish to remind you, the National Training Agency is the apex agency within Trinidad and Tobago, charged with the responsibility to coordinate the technical and vocational education and training in the country. We also pride ourselves in being the first Univoc center within Trinidad and Tobago, and therefore we remain committed to disseminating information that we believe pertinent to all stakeholders on a regular basis. We welcome you back. We took a small hiatus because of some conflicts for during the COVID period, but we are back with you today. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce my chairperson in the form of Dr. Ruby Alleyne, who is going to be presenting to us on a topic that we believe timely and important, both on the national sphere as well as our regional development. Our focus today is going to be on reforming education and training systems in the Caribbean, specifically looking at the role of the CARICOM Qualification framework. Dr. Alleyne is the chairperson of the Board of Directors of the National Training Agency, as well as the deputy chair of the Board of the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. She also serves as a member of the Commonwealth of Learning Transnational Qualification Framework Management Committee. This afternoon, Dr. Alleyne is going to take us through her presentation and share with us a wealth of information. I am sure that you're all eager and looking forward to this webinar this afternoon. So at this juncture, I would like to introduce and welcome Dr. Alleyne to make her presentation. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Paracils, and thank you for the opportunity to make this presentation this afternoon. I'd like to begin by welcoming all of the colleagues in Trinidad and Tobago and through the region. I know that some of the colleagues in the OECS have joined us from St. Lucia and other islands as well. We're very happy to have you here with us this afternoon. And we're happy to be talking about a framework that we've now approved and we're now implementing. One of the bugbears over the years has been that the region has been very good at developing frameworks. We've been working on frameworks since the 1990s, and it's perhaps fitting to pay tribute to some of the pioneers and persons who would have engaged in the development of some of those early frameworks. Some of them are no longer with us, some of them have passed on, and the names like Kiva Bethel from the Bahamas and Alfred Sangster from Jamaica, and Dr. Alvin Ashton, he's very much with us. He's at the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. He's a member of the board. There's Norma Holder, who would have passed as well from Barbados. There's Dr. Ethely London from Jamaica, who's still very much with us as well. And so there are a number of persons, Mrs. Althea Lawrence from the Committee on the Recognition of Degrees at NEHIS. She's still very much with us as well. Mrs. Marie Manshuk, NEHIS as well. So these are persons who would have paid a lot of attention to issues of quality assurance and regional frameworks over the years, and would have contributed in a large part to what we have today. So when we talk about frameworks now, we're going beyond just the development of a framework to talk about the implementation, and that's why implementation leads us to issues of reforming education and training systems in the Caribbean. So if I can go through my slides now. We need to go back to the first slide. There's a little technical glitch, so I'm going to pause so that we catch up to where I am in terms of the thank you. So we're talking about regional qualifications frameworks. And one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that there are a number of frameworks throughout the world. In terms of the regions of the world in which we can now find regional frameworks. Slide, please. Looking at the regions, yes. So you would see that in terms of the 17 frameworks that we mentioned, there are a number of frameworks still in okay. So can we catch up and just take me in terms of the slides, please? And I'll see next when it's time to switch the slide. Thank you very much. So I don't have control of it. So we're looking at the slide that says ownership and governance of RQF initiatives. And on it, you can see the 17 frameworks that have been identified at the moment as being active. And you'll see that within Africa, the continent of Africa alone, there are about 5 frameworks. If you look at the African Continental Qualifications Framework up at the top, but then if you look further down, you will see at number 5, there's another one that deals with French Africa. Then there are 2 East African frameworks. There's one at 7, and there's another one across on the other side of the page. And then there is the Southern African framework as well. So even within one continent, there are a number of frameworks, and that's a reason for that. Each regional framework is linked not just to a number of countries or nations, but also to the nature of the education systems that they represent. So there is an opportunity here in the Caribbean for us to now have one framework which will represent a number of education systems that we have in operation in the region. If we go to the next slide, we now focus on the development of the CQF, or the CARICOM Qualifications framework for the region. This development having taken place, the slide, please, yes. The region now has a common reference framework, which is set at 10 levels and which is described as a translation device. A translation device because it addresses a number of the issues that we've had over the years. You would do a qualification in, let's say, Trinidad and Tobago, and it would be called a certificate in welding, let's say, and it can be even given a level here. And then someone would ask about the equivalence of that qualification in, let's say, St. Lucia. And there has to be now a complete assessment of the curriculum, other assessment issues with the training providers to determine whether the qualification called a certificate at a certain level in Trinidad and Tobago is at the same level equivalent to the qualification in St. Lucia or in any other territory. So we've had that challenge for a number of years. That challenge also limits us in terms of movement throughout the region and also progression from one level to the next in terms of learning when we enter training providers to pursue qualifications at a higher level. So this CQF aims to address that by giving us a common framework where if each qualification is pegged against the levels in the CQF, we have that ease of translation across the region in terms of what the qualification means, in terms of what the person can do. So if we move to the next slide, we focus on the CQF development. Now, the CQF really went through a period of development and involved a wide range of stakeholders. So in terms of what has been approved by CARICOM and what we're now using, there has been a lot of stakeholder involvement. The reason for this is that our aim is to use the framework to make our qualifications throughout the region more transparent in terms of understanding learning outcomes, to increase the access that persons have to further learning as well as movement for employment, to ensure that we are common in terms of standards for quality and comparability. And next slide. And so the CQF assists us as a region in terms of achieving this. There are other benefits of having the framework. So we sat down around the table to develop it. It was important that all regions, all countries in the region, all member states were represented. Many of you who are participating this afternoon may remember the workshops we had in St. Lucia. There were 2 workshops in St. Lucia, one in 2012 and one in 2013. You would have had persons attending there who were representing the TVET councils in the region. The national accreditation bodies were all represented, the education divisions of ministries of government, and there were also other academics and researchers who were part of that. They were funded at that point in time by, I believe, the Commonwealth of Learning, and so we had some involvement from them as well. And we spent a number of days working through what we would have wanted as learning outcomes to be captured in a qualifications framework. Following those 2 developmental workshops, one at which the early developmental work was done, and another when we actually brought it back for further consideration, there was a workshop held at the CARICOM Secretariat in Guyana in 2016. And at that workshop, again, we brought persons together to look at the relevance of the framework to the work of the region in terms of the training institutions. So training institutions were invited to participate in that workshop, and also to look at the extent to which the national frameworks would now align with the regional framework. So quite a lot of work would have been done. We can move to the next slide. And a wide range of stakeholders would have been involved in the development. I would have facilitated all 3 workshops, and so I would have participated in the process from the beginning, coming right up to today. The framework that was developed then was approved by the Council on Human and Social Development of CARICOM in 2017. I believe we will see a slide coming up. And this approval would have been given so that member states would begin adopting the CQF, and the member states would begin using the CQF. I wanted to point to a few very important things in the CARICOM approval itself. And you would see the details of the that approval on the screen. And it really speaks to the fact that the region wanted to use the CQF as a reference system to streamline qualifications throughout the region and to promote seamlessness in the education and training system, which would mean that someone should be able to begin at level 1 on the framework and move throughout to level 10, which is the highest level in terms of education and training. It spoke about promoting harmonization of human resource development across the country, because there are some common elements in terms of the behaviors and competencies that persons should develop because they have acquired qualifications that are aligned to the framework, which you want throughout the region. They talked about facilitating the recognition of qualifications, not only within the region, but also enabling us to work towards international recognition through mutual recognition agreements with other nations. And they also talked about the fact that having approved the CARICOM draft framework, the intention was for member states to adopt it. We can move to the next slide. To adopt the CQF and also to work to the completion of the national qualifications frameworks by December 2018. Now that deadline would have gone, and there are several states which completed the development of their national qualifications frameworks and some which are currently working on it. What's the link between the regional framework and the national one? The regional framework will be a framework that will allow national frameworks to talk to each other, to relate to each other. So the national framework is a classification of the qualifications within that jurisdiction based on the learning outcomes and competencies that someone would have achieved. And the next slide, and the national framework can then be pegged against the regional framework. So the same as we talked about earlier, if you have a qualification in Trinidad and Tobago and it's called a certificate here, and it's at a level 2 for Trinidad and Tobago, when that qualification is pegged against the CQF or the regional framework, you then have an understanding of where it relates to or how it relates to other qualifications across the region, because every member state will be taking their national qualifications and aligning them to or pegging them to the regional framework. So there's a common understanding of what level means at the regional level, as opposed to just within national jurisdictions. We can move to the next slide. And so in terms of the role of the RQF, the regional framework, it really helps us to be able to ensure that there is a harmonization of the standards by which we approve or recognize qualifications across the region. Looking further at the objectives of the CQF, consistent with objectives of regional frameworks, we speak here to things like establishing a continuum of learning outcomes, so that you start at the entry level where the learner is just acquiring the very basic competencies and needs to be supervised and needs to be directed. And then it moves up to the level 2 and to the 3 and the level 4 and so on. And at each level, what you do is that you take the competency level a little bit higher, allowing the worker or the learner to be more independent, to require less supervision, to be able to take on more responsibility, and also to be able to move from just carrying out basic instructions to being able to develop and design and innovate, and also to be able to supervise other workers. So that's the kind of progression that takes place when you look at a continuum, and the learning outcomes in the framework accommodate that kind of movement upward in terms of learning. We also talk about encouraging lifelong learning, ensuring that informal as well as non-formal learning can be recognized, because being able to identify the level of competence that someone has means that if you have a prior learning and assessment and recognition system in your country, someone who may have acquired skills from their experience or on the job can also be assessed by a competent authority. The assessment can then say at what level the person's competence is, and that person can then also be recognized for the skills that they have acquired at a certain level outside of the formal education system and be certified by a competent authority such as a national training agency who offers that service. We can move to the next slide. Most of the objectives aligned there speak to transparency, intra-regional mobility of skills, ensuring a better understanding of what qualifications mean and what persons can do with the qualifications they have. So having established the CQF regional framework for the Caribbean region, our task at the moment is to implement. It's one of the areas that we have been slow on traditionally. The CQF at its very foundation used the development of the ideal Caribbean person, we can move to the next slide, as its foundation. That is to say that when the developers came together to design the CQF, to decide on what would go into this framework in terms of learning outcomes, they were guided by a very comprehensive description of the kinds of characteristics and qualities that we expect ideal Caribbean citizens to demonstrate. And that was taken from a CARICOM approved document. You can still find that in the CARICOM, the Caribbean Education Strategy, which was published in 2000. If you Google, you can find that. And in terms of the development of the framework, decision was taken that the CQF would not be a framework that required any legal underpinning or any kind of a regulatory foundation, which means that it is not being enforced. Member states are being asked to accept and to adopt it, but it's not being enforced. So at this point in time, you have a number of states who have aligned their national frameworks to the CQF, but we're moving in the direction where you would want all member states to do that. We can move to the next slide. The role of the CQF is to therefore communicate learning outcomes across member states in the region so that they are more clearly understood and that they can be used for mobility. We can move, and they can be used for mobility of persons throughout the region. We can move to the next slide. The CQF will also, over time, bring about some measure of change, some measure of reform in terms of curriculum and in terms of qualifications that are being awarded. And the very highest level, if we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. The very highest level that you can reach in terms of qualifications frameworks would be the transformational framework, which brings about a total change. That's not what we, at this point in time, expect of the CQF, because it's not being enforced that way. So in the CQF, there are 5 domains. The 5 domains were on the slide before this one. And those 5 domains speak to the knowledge component, to the application and practice. It speaks to ICT skills. We speak to autonomy and working together, and also speaks to life skills. So those would have been the 5 areas that would have been decided on in the workshops that would have to be captured in every qualification. And that's when the issue form starts to take on a certain kind of agenda. Because if we do not now revisit every qualification that we are awarding and ensure that these 5 domains are captured in the curriculum, not only in terms of the content, but also in terms of the assessment, how persons are being assessed for competence, then the CQF will simply be an instrument on paper. That's what has happened over the years, and that's what has happened in many countries, and that's what's still happening. You have on paper that every qualification is supposed to capture 5 domains, and that every domain really has learning outcomes which ensure that persons can acquire and demonstrate some skills. So we're staying with this for a minute. Looking at it, you understand that every qualification has to have a certain knowledge and understanding component. It also has to have some kind of development of skills that someone can use in terms of application and practice. It also has some element of communication skills, numeracy, or some kind of basic calculation, and also the use of ICT, information and communication technology, because that's critical. We also have some element of life skills which speak to the ability of individuals to manage themselves and to manage their relationships with others. And we can move to the next slide now. And we also talk about the extent to which someone can work independently with autonomy, the extent to which someone can take responsibility and be held accountable, and the extent to which persons can work as members of teams or work along with others. So that's the building blocks really of the qualifications that can be aligned to the CQF. The reference levels that we have, the 10 reference levels, really speak to the progression of an individual, of a learner, from the entry level into any education and training system and movement towards the highest level of qualification awarded in that education training system. And so we've captured the doctoral degree as the highest level of qualification awarded by the institutions in the region at level 10. And if you work your way from 10 coming back down, then you see the master's degree at 9, the postgraduate certificates and diplomas at 8, the bachelor's degree at 7, then the associate degrees come in at 6, and there is here now a distinction between the second year CAPE and the first year CAPE. And then you have the CSEC coming in, and then you go on now to some certificate levels at 1, 2, and 3. Interesting to note that the exit from the primary school level is at the level of the learning outcomes of what is called a certificate 2. So that this framework does not exclude anyone. The very basic entry level at level 1 would speak to someone who has the most basic level of skills, who can accept and follow basic instructions, and would therefore need to build on that to progress beyond that level 1, which will take you to level 2, which is equivalent to, broadly equivalent to the completion of primary school education. And this, therefore, you can move to the next slide, is a framework that caters for lifelong learning. And this is what the CQF, at the core of it, seeks to do. So we can move on to the next slide, looking now at the reform agenda. The reform agenda speaks to how do we change things up so that we now are in alignment with the CQF. Because the CQF is there, it's on paper, countries are being asked to implement it, but if nobody takes action on it, then it will simply remain a document that we refer to without it becoming a living system in terms of how we deal with qualifications in the region. So we can move to the next slide, because we're now just talking about those countries that have formally adopted the CQF. And at this point in time, in terms of government decisions, Grenada and Trinidad and Tobago are the only 2 countries that I'm aware of, and that I've checked that with the CARICOM Secretariat, who have made national decisions at the level of government to adopt the CARICOM Qualifications framework. That's not to say that other countries are not aligning their frameworks there, but there was a formal adoption in those 2 countries. In terms of national frameworks, those that have been developed in the region so far, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Cayman Islands, which is an associate member of CARICOM. And at the moment, Trinidad and Tobago, the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago, we can move to the next slide because there's a little delay with the slide movement, and the National Training Agency have both been given the mandate to develop the National Qualifications Framework and have completed that work, and that is with the Ministry of Education. So in terms of reform action, the next step, once you've aligned or adopted the CQF, developed a national framework, the next step is the development of a national quality assurance framework that will allow you to implement the changes that need to be made in order for qualifications to be aligned to the framework. And so we're talking about the role of the national accreditation bodies. There are some countries that are working towards establishing qualifications authorities. And there are also some countries in which the education ministries, we can move to the next slide, and divisions are the ones who are responsible for setting up the quality assurance framework at the national level so that those qualifications can be aligned to the regional framework. One of the things to bear in mind is that the implementation of a national qualifications framework or regional framework takes years. When you do the research, you see that, for example, the implementation of the frameworks in Scotland and New Zealand would have taken 15 to 20 years. The implementation of the framework in Australia would have taken about 10 years. So sometimes we in the region get very impatient when we're doing things like this and we expect very quick and immediate results. That's not what we should be thinking. Reform Action Force speaks to that. There's going to have to be a lot of curriculum reform in order for us to truly say that we have qualifications that are consistent with our national frameworks and can therefore be aligned to the regional framework. It means that every curriculum now has to be reviewed to ensure that the components that were described earlier in terms of the 5 domains, as well as the learning outcomes at each level, are adjusted, amended, revised, reviewed, whatever. But there's curriculum work that has to be done so that those qualifications really meet the requirements of the framework. You can move to the next slide. And while that work is taking place with the training providers, we can expect the accreditation bodies, such as the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago, and the National Training Agency with its remit for quality assurance of TVET programs to provide guidance and support to the institutions in this curriculum reform process. One of the other reforms that we need is that the transcripts at the moment that are issued by institutions only speak to the courses that or subjects that someone would have completed and would have passed. In order for the regional framework to work in terms of the movement of persons throughout the region, talking about portability of qualifications, there is a recognition tool that needs to be developed. And that recognition tool can be in the form of a qualification statement. And this is very similar to what's offered in the European region as the diploma supplement, or at the level of TVET qualifications, they have the certificate supplement. But what it is a separate statement that's issued by training providers that will now identify the learning outcomes and the level on the national framework that the qualification sits at, and will also give a comparable level that the qualification is pegged at on the regional framework or the CQF. And you get all of that on this statement, which is specific to the learner, and therefore gives, you can go to the next slide, gives either the training institution who is receiving the qualification or the employer who is seeking to employ the person who has the qualification a better understanding of that qualification in the regional context. So once these statements are issued, no longer will someone have to wonder if they're moving from Dominica to work in Jamaica. When the person presents the qualification in Jamaica, they will not have to wonder, well, okay, it's called a diploma in Dominica, but what does it mean here in our system? No, the qualification statement will be clear in terms of the level of the qualification in Dominica, and it will also give an equivalent level of the qualification on the regional framework, so that it's easily understood where it's being received, in this case, in this example, in Jamaica. Reform Action 6 speaks to something that has been in the works for a while and something that also has to be done. We're giving a very big responsibility to the quality assurance bodies in the region, the national accreditation bodies and the TVET councils and the NTAs are taking on that responsibility of quality assurance to ensure that the reform is taking place with respect to qualifications being issued by institutions, and that those qualifications are therefore acceptable in terms of the being registered on or being aligned to the national frameworks. Where there's another level that we have to look at, then who's really looking at the quality of the quality assurance bodies? So for some time, we have recognized in the region that there's a gap, that our national accreditation bodies operate in an environment in which there isn't an overarching oversight mechanism to ensure that the national accreditation bodies and external quality assurance agencies in general are being monitored, are being evaluated, and that they themselves are operating to standards that are acceptable. So CARICOM has a development at the moment to set up or to establish the CARICOM Quality Assurance Register. This register will establish standards that all accreditation bodies or quality assurance agencies must meet. And there will be a mechanism by which they will be evaluated, by which they will be recognized, and by which they will be placed on this register. We will therefore have in the Caribbean a register of external quality assurance agencies that have been assessed and determined to have met standards which are determined by the region and which are also upheld by the region. We can move to the next slide. So once this is in place, it kind of closes the loop on external quality assurance for the region. The decision was taken at the 38th meeting of the COSOD, the Council on Human and Social Development. And they have also asked that at the national level, by December 2021, that the member states make whatever adjustments they need to ensure that all of the external quality assurance agencies can meet the requirements for registration by the regional register. This is important because there has to be a period of time during which the accreditation bodies will be introduced to the new standards, and they will be given time to make an adjustment so that at the end of the day, we will have a situation where they all would have made the necessary changes to meet the standards set by the region. We can move to the next slide. I'm not sure that December 2021 will be kept because a number of agencies, of course, because of the pandemic, would have had to close their doors at times, and a lot of the institutions would have been closed, so the agencies would not have been operating at full steam. And so there is going to be a period of, I believe, a period during which there have to be an extension of any arrangement with respect to this. And if we can move to the next slide, because we're kind of winding down on the reform actions now. The way forward for us, we have a CARICOM regional qualifications framework now. You can go back, please. That framework has now been approved by CARICOM at the regional level. The framework is now being adopted by individual member states. Can you go back to this slide before, please? Once adopted by individual member states, we are now working on the development of the national qualifications frameworks, and several countries have already done that. Once the national frameworks are developed, institutions are being asked, that's teaching institutions and training institutions, are being asked to undertake the curriculum reform that they need to ensure that their qualifications meet the standards set in the national qualification framework. And once they've made those adjustments and the national accreditation bodies can approve the new qualifications or the revised qualifications, then they can also be pegged at the level that they are on the CARICOM qualifications framework, and we can move towards the development of recognition tools such as a CARICOM qualification statement, where you will see the level of the qualification at the national level as well as the regional framework. And of course, the full operationalization of the regional register for external quality assurance agencies is important. So in closing, we can look at what's required of training institutions, which is curriculum reform, what's required of national accreditation bodies, which is some capacity building with respect to the ability to approve qualifications against the national frameworks, and the alignment of those qualifications to the regional framework. We can move to the last slide. And the last one is one before that one, but if we can move to the next slide, please. And we can also it's a little delay getting to the next slide. Thank you. We can look at the fact that having the regional framework also strengthens our position globally. There is a UNESCO Convention on the recognition of qualifications, international recognition of qualifications, that some countries are currently considering. In order to be able to even have a formal alignment of your framework to another regional framework, it has to be implemented. In our CQF report, we talk about it being aligned to the European framework. It's not really a formal alignment. It's simply looking at the comparable level of our qualifications when considered with other regional frameworks. But in order to have a formal alignment, a formal recognition, which will serve in terms of the international mobility of skills, then we do need to have a fully operationalized and implemented regional framework. Can you please move to the next slide? So as we seek to close off this part of the presentation, it is really to encourage those persons who are working in the different stakeholder groups, those who are working in the national accreditation bodies, to focus on the approval processes that need to be implemented for qualifications on the national frameworks, to also work towards the development of recognition tools that can assist in terms of comparing the qualifications with the regional framework. And for persons in the teaching and training institutions, it's about taking that curriculum reform initiative seriously, because those changes would have to be made or the framework just lives on paper. It's not a living system. And I wanted to end with this because often when we're introducing reform in the region, we start to question whether what we were doing before was good enough. Well, what we were doing before was the best we could have done then. And as Maya Angelou would have said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So as we move forward, what we had as good enough before is not going to be good enough as we look towards building the future. And this is the call for reform and for improvement on an ongoing basis. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. And we will now look at some questions that may have been posed. Thank you. I'm not hearing you, Dr. Parasu. I'm not hearing you, Dr. Parasu.
I apologize. I was still muted. So thank you very much, Dr. Alleyne, for that presentation. And I wanted to officially apologize to both you and our listening viewing audience for the technical difficulties that we had, especially in navigating your slides. We will endeavor to ensure that the presenters have more control over their presentations going forward. So that is on us, but I thank you and I commend you for still forging ahead and delivering your presentation. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the point where we will attempt to field some questions that came from our viewers, and we will attempt to go through as many as we can within the remaining time period. So I guess a number of queries would have come in, Dr. Alleyne. They all are related more or less to a better understanding of the role of regulatory bodies such as the ACTT and the NTA now that we have a qualification framework for the region. So one viewer asks if the CQF is for communication, why is a quality assurance framework needed? And does this mean that regulatory bodies such as the ACTT and NTA should no longer review and approve programs on qualification?
Okay, so let me take that question from the national level. The CQF is a communications framework, yes. But in order for it to work, we must have national frameworks that relate to it. At the level of the national framework, there must be a quality assurance mechanism. Because other than that, what you will have is, for example, let's just say, if you don't have a quality assurance system at the national level, a training provider could say his qualification is at a level 6 on the national framework, and that the comparable level is a level 6 or 7, whatever it is on the regional framework. And whose word are we just taking for it? You can't take the word of the training provider for it. There has to be a mechanism that actually verifies that what the training provider puts forward at his qualification level has been quality assured and has been accepted by a competent authority. And therefore, at the national level, if we confirm through the work of the NTA or the ACTT that this qualification has been reviewed and really does hold in it the learning outcomes at level 7 and can be accepted at that level, then we can with ease say what the comparable level is at the on the regional framework, and it can be accepted for mobility. So it's really a check and balance that has to be in place at the national level to ensure that the recognition or acceptance of qualifications is valid before you can go on to say that it can be aligned to the regional framework.
Thank you for that.
So the checks and balances have to be in there at the national level. And therefore, the accreditation councils and the national training agencies do have that role to play.
Appreciated. So who then, therefore, is actually in charge?
I think there was a second part of the question of
right, it was.
I think there was a second part that spoke to something about whether they will.
Right, so the question would have been, if the CQF is for communication, why is a quality assurance framework needed? And does this mean that regulatory bodies like ACTT and NTA no longer need to review and approve programs and qualifications? I do believe that you answered that question. So I think you could have
answered both parts of it.
Yes. So the other question is related to in terms of who exactly is in charge of the rollout, implementation, and operationalization of the CQF.
That's an interesting question. Because as I said, having been approved by the Council on Human Social Development, the rollout of the CQF is being managed by the CARICOM Secretariat. So within the CARICOM Secretariat, what they would do is communicate with member states through their mechanism, and it's usually through the Ministries of Foreign Affairs in a lot of the territories, to determine what action would have been taken to implement or to adopt the CQF. And it is through the CARICOM Secretariat that I was able to gather that there was that formal adoption in Grenada. And I know as well, of course, of the formal adoption in Trinidad and Tobago. And we have no other information at this point in time other than that. So it is the CARICOM Secretariat who is responsible for that rollout of the CQF.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alleyne. So tied to that is a query in terms of your quality assurance register. The question is the establishment of the register hinged on the acceptance of CQF by all member states?
Yes, and the short answer to that is no. So the CQF imposes a structure for the recognition of qualifications against certain criteria or levels established at the regional level. The CQAR, the CARICOM Qualifications, the CARICOM Quality Assurance Register is a little bit different. The issue there is that there is no one guarding the guards. The national accreditation bodies have a responsibility in all the territories in which they exist to make determinations about the quality of training providers and to ensure that education and training providers at all levels meet the standards for approval by the accreditation bodies. But who's looking at the quality of the accreditation bodies themselves? So if you look at the North American situation, there's a Council for Higher Education Accreditation chair that has an oversight role for the accreditation bodies in the US region. And similarly, that's what CARICOM wants to set up, a body that has oversight responsibility for monitoring the standards at which the accreditation bodies in the region are operating and the standards which they uphold, and setting as well some guidelines for the good practice and of the accreditation bodies in the region. So it really doesn't matter whether the CQF is accepted or not in the member state. It's a separate issue, but the quality of the accreditation bodies themselves is what the register will be looking at.
Thank you very much for that clarification. So another question is tied to the 5-level regional qualification that many providers are already familiar with. So the member asked, what is the rule now for the 5-level regional framework that is normally used for regional TVET?
Right. Well, I know again from the CARICOM Secretariat that the Caribbean Association of National Training Authorities, CANTA, had been given the responsibility to integrate that 5-level framework into the CQF, and therefore to identify the comparable level of the 5 levels against the 10 in the CQF. And I know that that had been done by CANTA. I don't have I can't say if it was approved at the CARICOM level as yet, but I know that the work was done by CANTA and was shared with the CARICOM Secretariat. So there is an integration and alignment of those 5 regional TVET levels against the CQF.
Thank you. So this is our final question. Unless you see someone else post something shortly, it asks, this is an exciting ideal, but what, in your opinion, is the actual desire of regional member states to recognize and accept each other's qualifications?
I think there is an appetite for recognizing and accepting qualifications across the region that's driven by this desire for the movement of workers throughout the region. There are a number of job opportunities opening up in countries across the region, and persons from member states have been seeking to move in terms of where they live and where they work. And because of the importance of having a valid qualification, or one that can be recognized, or one that can be accepted for your movement, that kind of makes this whole initiative even more relevant to what people are doing and what people want. So the CSME skills certificate has been issued for a long time, but there are always issues with the CSME skills certificate, and it only deals with certain categories of workers as well. What we have an opportunity here for now, because of the CQF, is an opportunity to go beyond where we have been in terms of those categories of workers who have been allowed to move, because there would be a solid foundation which member states could enter into agreements where they can feel confident that the qualifications that are being brought by individuals seeking to work or to study in their particular territory would have gone through a very careful validation process at the national level and been determined to be acceptable based on the alignment to the CQF at the regional level as well. So it gives more confidence to those persons who have to manage those systems. And therefore, what we're seeing is that there is a huge interest and there is a huge appetite for full implementation of the national and regional frameworks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alleyne. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that question, we now have arrived at the end of our 15th session. And I once again want to thank Dr. Alleyne for taking the time to support this initiative. I think if it is that there is any one clear takeaway that I would want to reiterate is just the notion that this continues to be a work in progress. And while it may be slower than what some expected and hoped for, it remains a step in the right direction. So to our listening and viewing audience, I want to just once again thank you, because we recognize at the NTA that the continued success of this webinar series is hinged on your support and you showing up on the Thursdays to join us and to just spend some time interrogating the different topics with us. You are reminded that if it is that there is any issue, concept, notion that you would like us to address, do feel free to reach out to us and email us at webinar@ntatt.org. And if it is that you're interested in watching any of our previously hosted webinars, do feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Once again, in the midst of our ongoing pandemic across the globe, we want you to be blessed, be safe, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you again, everyone.